Hi, I'm Kirk Kernut.
And I'm Ashley Gordon.
Welcome to another episode of Reading for the Rest of Us. And today's theme is yummy, yummy, yummy. I've got books on my tummy.
Oh God, really? He didn't tell me that in advance. He said he was going to bring something on me. Who is that? Like the Monkees or?
No, I'm not even sure who sang that song, but
So now I'm getting flashbacks of you reading the Beatles in the basement. You know, your introduction to literature through pop music.
keep your focus on the yummy, yummy, yummy part, because
Okay.
today's show is about food and books.
Yes.
And about the
Well, but
relationship.
they're related. I mean, we come at books from other directions.
Sure.
That's why it's called Reading for the Rest of Us, because you don't have to think of yourself as a book person to find something of interest in what we discuss, right?
Right. It's interesting because I think the relationship between eating and reading is one that
Do you eat and read at the same time?
Of course, don't you?
I do.
Yeah.
And I feel compelled to. What do you eat when you read?
Well, it just depends. It might be dinner. It might be a snack. The real question is, where do you do it?
Well, like you're sitting on the sofa and you're reading a book. Microwave popcorn tends to be my thing because we don't get buttered popcorn, which all of my children's friends' moms will know, because every time my kids go to somebody else's house, they get all wiggy because it's buttered popcorn. So not really part of the reason, but one of the benefits of not having buttered microwave popcorn is that you can sit there and eat it on the couch with your book and not get grease everywhere.
Right.
Because you kind of need the other thing, right, while you're eating?
Well, I think that's one of the interesting things about the relationship between reading and eating. It's almost like a left-hand, right-hand type of thing. It's like gives us a sort of balance to both of those activities. So it's interesting over the course of just talking about the reading experience. Eating is probably the activity that comes up more often than any other.
In the book or in talking about books?
No, in talking about books and talking about the relationship between books and our how they interact with our daily lives.
Reading and drinking.
Well, drinking is a big one. But I think eating
book
is
groups,
even more.
The wine, that's where I was headed with that.
I think it's even more basic because I think there's a sort of, I don't know, philosophical, if you want to call it, relationship between the way that we take in words and that we take in food. I mean, they're both acts of consumption. And, we devour books. Think of all of our metaphors for how we treat our books.
That's interesting. I've always thought of books as bread, almost. And I spend way too much money, just sort of generally, but particularly on books. And when I was younger and I was trying to justify these expenses, well, it's like food. I don't beat myself up for what I buy at the grocery store.
Right.
Why would I beat myself up for what I just spent at the bookstore? So that is very true. They've always been likened in my head, at least in terms of the credit card bill.
You might say that we need books almost as much as we need food.
Oh, I think some of us do.
KNEAD.
Okay.
There's a lot of...
Man, we started at yummy, yummy, yummy books on my tummy. We've just gone downhill from there.
I've been sitting on that pun for months.
Wow, you've been saving that one. Okay.
We wanted to talk about some of the different ways that food pops up in books and sort of defines it. And we want to talk about both nonfiction and fiction. But there's an obvious genre to start with about books and food, and we think of cookbooks.
Right.
And you're a big cookbook fan. What do you enjoy about reading cookbooks?
Well, and this is where I got the idea for even having this show, because my current favorite cookbook is A Girl and Her Pig, and it's April Bloomfield. She's a British chef. She has a couple of restaurants, one in New York called The Spotted Pig, where I've been a couple of times, and found out when I asked for mayonnaise for my fries, well, April doesn't like mayonnaise, so there's no mayonnaise in the entire establishment. And that kind of personality that's visible through her restaurant menu is also visible in her cookbook.
Right.
And I've thoroughly enjoyed getting to read about her and growing up maybe not with food, and I related to that because growing up in the South, I had the grandmother who fried the chicken and could do the turnip greens, but cooking was not considered an art. It was important, and obviously our lives revolved around the kitchen table or the dining room table, but the idea of cooking as creativity was not something that I learned about until maybe 2 or 3 years ago.
I think that's an excellent point. I think that we often think of cookbooks as sort of instruction guides,
right.
but I think in more recent years they become less and less about that and more about personalities.
Well,
and
maybe
life
the
stories.
Julie and Julia book. I didn't bring that one, but thinking about it, the idea of blogging and learning to cook, and then the cooking as creativity, the cookbooks seem to have evolved. I mean, there is a little bit of personality in The Joy of Cooking, which is the one I started with, because, you know, let's start with the most complicated. But you still don't really know who's behind that book. And now cookbooks are just completely infused with the personality of the chef. And so that's one of the things that makes this cookbook so much fun, and what got me thinking about, well, I read cookbooks, and then where else does food appear in what I read?
I think what's kind of fun about them too is I think the bringing out of the personality reminds us that both eating and reading are social activities. We tend to think of eating as a group thing, but in reality a lot of times we do it by ourselves, and certainly our sense of taste is really private. But reading's a little different because we tend to think of reading as a very private thing, and yet we often find ourselves doing it in public places, or we read in groups.
And talking about what we read. And
exactly.
And there's, in technology now, there's this drive to try to figure out social reading. Since everything else is becoming an online social event, there's several startup companies that are trying to make reading a social event, so that you read something at the same time, you annotate it together. I've struggled with those platforms and trying to use them, but they're out there, and definitely people are trying to figure out how to make reading communal.
Right. So the idea of cookbooks then is kind of a starting point where we think of the way that it opens us up to the experience of food in a communal way. But there are other types of books about food, nonfiction books, and one of the things that you also love are kind of travelogues or histories.
Yeah, those are fun. Well, and the kind of serious ones, like The Food of Spain, this is almost encyclopedic, and it's beautiful photographs and the culture of Spain and the history of Spain through its food, and their recipes, of course, but there's just as much of everything else about it. And same with the foods of the Greek Isles, and you learn about the people and the role of food and what they eat in certain holidays, and how a dish might have evolved around a particular ingredient that was unique or particularly valued. And so you go from that to the Peter Mayle and French lessons, or Under the Tuscan Sun, and they seem to work particularly well in France and Italy and areas of the Mediterranean. Not sure why that would be.
Well, I think that cuisine is so, probably for us as Americans, that cuisine is so exotic and it seems so elaborate and ceremonial, as opposed to, you know, our kind of
it is ceremonial,
faster food culture.
Definitely in French lessons, which has made me laugh right out loud. The way that the French approach the food, and also the Italians, although this one isn't quite as funny, but it's fascinating with the trips to the market and the building of the houses and the kitchens and the role of the kitchen in the house, and then where the table lives, and then the events that happen around that table. A table figures fairly prominently in Under the Tuscan Sun. So this one becomes very charming because it's so clearly in love with the place and the people. And French lesson is very funny because it's Peter Mayle being self-deprecating about himself and being British, and pointing out in admiration, but also a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, of the French and their frog's legs and truffles and the ceremonies around them, and that church is more more populated on the days when the truffles are being blessed. Sort of thing.
What about the southern book that you brought?
Oh, this is fun. This is fun. This is John T. Edge, which would be a familiar food writer to anybody down here. And then this is the tour of the South through its restaurants, particularly the dives and the quirky places and the one-offs. So he takes us through each of the states and some barbecue and the things that we all grew up on.
Is there any particular stops, Alabama stops, that folks might be?
Oh man, you threw that one at me. That I was not prepared for.
Oh, that's all right.
I don't know. Mary Mac's Tea Room. I mean, they're just they're little bitty town places. Fried Chicken and the Legacy of the Late Deacon Burton. I mean, they're the kinds of places that we all remember growing up. Like Jake and I had this conversation the other night. I remember Joe's Deli vividly. The smell the minute you walked in. Cloverdale, and we always got hot pastrami on rye with Swiss and slaw and mustard, and that was what my dad and I always got. Or Chris's hot dogs. That one, thankfully, my children remember. That's their memory restaurant. And we were just wondering, as children grow up now, what are the places that they will associate with their childhood? Like Ligger's Bakery was another one for me when I was little. That was so special. They knew you when you walked in. There was a gingerbread man waiting for me when I got there. I mean, what are the restaurants are imbued with this sense of place, which is what we've talked about before with books, that sense of place is often what will make a novel so real to you. So they're all kind of
the best restaurant in Montgomery that has disappeared.
Martha's?
Well, that's a close
another
one.
Another going to downtown.
There's one that I liked even better, which was the Olive Room, which was around for, I don't know, 16, 17 years.
Yeah, that one
wonderfully
was artsy and elegant.
Very Art Deco. And
yeah, I was going for plastic tablecloths.
Had a little, had little tables off in little dark corners where you could
and a non-gender specific bathroom that people often got lost in, or maybe
looked like something out of Star Trek.
Yeah, it did.
It was kind of, you thought you were beamed into the transporter room or something. Let's switch gears a little bit then and talk about fiction, because there's a whole movement called Foody Fiction that's kind of popped up.
Yeah, when I was searching for some other books besides the ones I had read, I didn't realize there was such a thing as Foody Fiction.
No, it's huge. You think about it, and again, it seems pretty obvious that food is going to show up in fiction because it's just a normal everyday activity. And sometimes it just feels like it's in there because you need for a character to do something, But
yeah, but sometimes it's really integral to the character's life and the events.
Yeah.
And then it makes you, when you realize it doesn't figure in at all in other stories, like, well, when did these people eat?
Well, I do think that food often becomes an index to the character that we're dealing with. And one of the interesting things is you get these characters who are chefs or who who
have you seen 100-Foot Journey?
No, but that's one of the books that I was.
Wonderful.
That's one of the books that I was
going
to mention.
The movie's fantastic. We just saw it.
That is a huge foodie novel. So.
Wonderful movie.
Richard C. Morris, I think, is the guy.
Yeah,
that wrote
it is M-O-R-A-I-S, because I just looked for it at the library. Yeah, so that one's going to be a special order.
Can you think of any books that you enjoy where the characters are like big-time food people who tend to define themselves by the meals that they eat?
Well, the only ones I can think of are all Italian and Sicilian detectives.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because detective novels, there's, in Foody Fiction, a huge chunk of those are detective novels. And in fact,
I didn't know if it was detectives, because it's not so much in P.D. James or some of the other British.
Well, I think it's a more contemporary thing.
Mediterranean.
And I think it links to the cozy genre of the detective novel, which is traditionally.
I take issue with that.
Well, but I do
Not
think
that there's anything wrong with cozies. They're okay.
Well, I'm thinking of, in particular, someone like Joanne Fink,
okay.
who's written this whole series of detective novels. You know, Apple Turnover Murder, Devil Foods, Cake Murder, Cinnamon Roll Murder.
Where the food is front and center. That's
and I
the
mean,
point.
that's kind of the fun gimmickry of it, and I don't mean that in a bad way.
Gotcha.
But the food becomes the sort of sustaining link from book to book. And that's what people seem to enjoy about it. So, and most of these books do come with recipes. That's one of the things we wanted to talk about, was the whole phenomenon of including recipes in books.
In the story.
Yeah, and there's a book that really, I think, it certainly wasn't the first one ever, but there was a book about 25 years ago that really kicked that whole genre off in a lot of ways.
Well, the book itself was a phenomenon.
Yeah, you brought a copy of that.
Yeah, and it's one of the first that I ever read where I noticed this happening. But like Water for Chocolate, set in Mexico.
Right.
And we have done a show once before about using books to travel to other places. I think it was the dead of winter, and we all wanted to be someplace else. And so if a book is taking you somewhere else and it is capturing the culture and the place, then the food is obviously a bridge to do that. And and this book is so sensual in all of its storytelling.
I think that's one of the main reasons that food gets written a lot about, is because it allows us to dramatize appetite. And we go from sort of
and there's plenty of appetite in this book.
Yeah, we go from gastronomic appetite, the appetite for food, to the appetite for we know what else.
Well,
right?
but food that goes back to the food and cooking being creative.
Yeah.
Where food clearly is a substitution for other kinds of satisfaction. Like cooking, to me, has become an intellectual exercise, because if I get a really complicated recipe and I make everybody leave the house for hours at a time, then I can focus on it and everything else goes away. And then obviously, you know, eating Doritos instead of having other happy things in your life, you know, food can be a substitution in a lot of ways.
Well, it can be a substitution. It's also an aphrodisiac. I mean, foods are
oysters.
Food,
I have an entire cookbook called Interludes, and
there you go.
And every single I wasn't married when I bought that book, but I bought it for Jake.
But the the notion is that I think for writers there's an effort to recreate in the sensuality of the language, the sensuality of this experience, whether it's eating, whether it's the romance or the passion. And all of these things sort of become linked up to one another. And I think part of the fun of these types of experiences is it sort of shakes us up out of the complacency of our patterns of food consumption. I mean, think how many times a week would you say that you really sit down to enjoy a meal?
Yeah, and how often do you eat the same thing?
Right.
Over and over. And I think, like, for instance, in this book, it's broken out by the chapters correspond to months. We're watching the passage of time, and for each month there's a recipe. And in this case, it's oxtail soup, which is not something I eat on a regular basis, but is very traditional in their culture,
right.
and helping us to, like the chapter on frog's legs, and Peter Mayle having never had those except once before. I mean, the idea of food as the exotic and setting the stage possibly for our being open to a different kind of experience and people coming at us from a different place.
I think on a very basic level, it's hard to imagine a book like Water for Chocolate appealing to us if it was about 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. You know, I just
Okay,
don't...
well, by the same token, I wonder what like Water for Chocolate would have done as a Mexican romance.
Sure.
Because I wonder if food is how... Is that the universal thing? Is that how many people would have read? Because what did it say that this book had sold? Like in the millions of copies.
Yeah.
It was a bestseller in Mexico before it made it here. But but it's not as if we have bestsellers coming out of Mexico on a regular basis.
Right.
So I wonder if food then becomes, again, the bridge across the cultures, and
Yeah.
that was what made it more accessible. Not that it wasn't beautiful writing and a wonderful story, and clearly it could stand on its own, but does the inclusion of the recipes make it a safe thing, an appealing thing in a way that maybe it otherwise wouldn't have been?
I think so, very much so. I think there is a sense with those foods too that you're getting. You said exotic, but I also think they're in some ways very much of the land, which is something we don't experience anymore. I mean, if very few of us grow our own food anymore, so it's
or
that
even have our children know how it got to where it is.
Yeah, so I think there's a part of what Foody Fiction appeals to is the whole cycle, in a sense, of food growth and cultivation and harvesting and then eating. It's like it almost has fun with that whole cycle in a way that says to those of us, who stop at Five Guys on the way home or something.
Oh gosh, there's one now at the gate where I often fly out of in the Atlanta airport. It's just brutal.
They're everywhere.
It's very tempting.
You brought a local favorite, though, that has a very famous food scene in it.
It does, and I've thought about this one a lot too growing up. So I was thinking about, when we decided to do this, the role that food plays in the story and how meals are used to exhibit mores and values and to reveal character, of course, but to teach lessons.
Yeah.
And this is the scene early in To Kill a Mockingbird, where they're at home for lunch, and they have Walter there visiting, and he wants molasses to put on his vegetables. And Scout, of course, is not only appalled at what he's doing, but she's also baffled at Atticus's behavior and Calpurnia's behavior in accommodating Walter. So it's a wonderful lesson about how you behave when there's a guest in your home, how to accommodate difference, and it's one I've used with my kids often in helping them to, when somebody's at our table, it's our job to make them happy. That's what the host does, and the guest goes first. That's one that they can recite pretty quickly.
That's a great example of what we were talking about earlier about the communalism of eating and sort of the necessity of teaching the social graces at the
but there's so much more than social graces, and I think maybe that's what makes this so important, is that in the early pages of the book, it seems like nothing more than that. Social graces and good manners, and manners, of course, were and are important in the South. But when you see what happens later, and the respect for humanity, for individuality, for the allowances of making room for other people, there are examples of that all throughout the book. And of course, that's the point, that you can't know another until you've stepped into his skin and walked around in it. And this is just the very beginning of that. So it's so much more than social graces.
Yeah. Okay. Another one that we realized that we're both mutual fans of is Jason Goodwin's series about Yashmin, the 1830s eunuch in Turkey, but
try to explain that one to somebody
who not only solves murders in the Sultan's court, but he's also a prime chef.
And they're fascinating. They're absolutely fascinating. Well, the mysteries are good. The talking about the spices and the ingredients, a little bit of history that's thrown in there. They really are completely surprising and lots of fun.
And there's actually, if you go online, there's actually a free cookbook available.
Is there really?
Of
I didn't
Yashmin's recipes. So it's kind of a fun treat for fans of the series that can go out there and
kind of like fan fiction that we've talked about. I seem to be referencing every show we've ever done before today. But the idea of extending the book beyond just that moment or the characters or the experience, how do you take it with you? I've had an idea trying to start a book group down in Fairhope around some European books from Europa editions, like those detective novels I was talking about. What I would love for us to do is every month come together with the book, and then let's have some food from the place where the book is set, because it so often figures in to the story.
Yeah.
So I think you want to extend it.
Right,
you want to find some way to carry it with you. So a cookbook based on what happens in the series would be wonderful.
One last one that I am a fan of.
I think this is just the cover got you here.
Well, it is, but it's also, I mean, it's almost looks like a mashup in a way. It's called Cinnamon and Gunpowder by Eli Brown, and the whole point of the book is you have a female pirate who kidnaps a chef, and he has to
cook for her
in order to stay alive. Now they're on a ship, so he has a limited sort of.
It's very challenging.
Right,
chopped at sea.
Yeah, he's got to make meals for her and keep on.
Oh, that would be a cool
graces.
idea for a television show. If we're going to have reality TV, let's mash up, just like you said, with the Cinnamon and Gunpowder. Maybe we could get authors and aspiring chefs.
There you go.
And, yeah, okay.
Okay.
Or not.
Favorite, can you name a favorite book, your favorite novel about food?
About food? Why are you doing this to me today?
Is that coming too quickly off the top of your head?
Yeah, I have not a clue. I don't think I could name a favorite.
Okay.
What's yours? I need to turn these back on you. You've been putting me on the spot.
Can you think of any major eating scenes that we haven't talked about?
No. Hey, man, you are hanging me out to dry today.
You've got one more over there that we didn't talk about.
Which one?
The autumn and the.
Oh, well, this is it's detective series.
Okay.
These are my go-to.
Right.
Police procedurals. This one is set with a lot of expatriate Algerians near Catalonia, and so the kind of food that they're eating has to constantly be explained. There are little annotations about the food.
Oh, okay.
I guess if I had to, Camilleri, the Sicilian detective.
Okay.
His housekeeper cooks for him, and we always get to find out what's waiting for him, and his mood is often wrapped up in whatever she's left and whether or not it's been spoiled. But there's also a local cafe, and the sort of food of the day, the fish of the day, those are the most fun.
Yeah.
God, next time warn me.
I was just thinking though that we were talking about all the surprising places that food pops up in, and I was rereading Casino Royale recently, and I had forgotten that
There's food in that?
Yeah, that James Bond talks about food
I didn't remember that
all the
at all.
time. Talks about how to eat caviar, and so it really does pop up in the most unusual.
I'll have to go back and reread that now and look for it.
You don't think of James Bond as taking the time to think about food, but he was very
satisfying
food obsessed.
appetites, maybe.
There you go.
But wouldn't have thought he would go into cooking.
Well, we are out of time, and we're also very hungry after that conversation.
I am hungry. I didn't have lunch today. But the list of all of what we've talked about will be on our Facebook page with links, so you can find these books, since we kind of fly through them today.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and we will see you in our next episode.